Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we're coming to the end of another day at this retreat, and I know that we've had discussions, workshops, lectures, and I'm going to try to take it easy by, even though I don't have a clock in front of me to let me know when I'm running close to or liable to go over my time, I'm going to try to keep it within a reasonable amount of time and give a few thoughts on the topic that was given to me, which is the patience of an activist. And this is a topic which it's extremely important for us to think about. Because we have, of course, a hadith that do indicate that patience is in fact one of the key or the most important attributes of a believer. It is reported that the Prophet was asked, what is Iman? Iman is patience. And that is a key part of Iman, no matter how it may be defined and how it may be looked at. And for those of us who want to keep alive and to traverse the path of the prophets and the Prophet of Islam and the Imams, it is that much more important for us to develop. It's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He took special care to ensure that His prophets were trained in, to be patient. So we have in some reports that many of the prophets, before they were appointed as a prophet by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they engaged in shepherding animals, because that is a very difficult job and it kind of trains a person to try to communicate with animals that cannot communicate back. And that really takes a great deal of personal development and strength to be able to do. Now today, sometimes that parable may seem to be condescending, to say that, well, shepherding sheep is a good training for being a prophet of God. But the element that is being trained and that is being practiced is the patience. And the ability to engage with animals that seem not to be able to understand or have any intellect of their own. It isn't to treat people that way. That false impression, of course, should not be taken. So our Imams, our prophets, something that their preparation for their role entailed was to reach the highest level of sabr. In some cases now we have that training explained to us in the Quran or in traditions. And especially with previous prophets, for example, we have ways that readiness for the task of guiding or leading or working with a community was brought to the Prophet. The story of Nuh alayhi salam indicates that he preached among his people for close to 1,000 years. It's the exact words of the Quran, 950 years. And the story of Ayub, which is recited before I gave my speech, it indicates that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tried him through different kinds of tests that if any of us were subjected to, any one of them might be enough to make us forget any obligation we have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or anything else that is going on in our life. The tragedies of health, of loss of property and wealth, loss of near and dear ones and family members, and then the ridicule or the ostracization from society. All of those things individually are very severe tests, let alone when they come all together. Similarly, we have the test of Ibrahim alayhi salam when he was asked to sacrifice his son. It's also detailed in the Quran. So in some cases, we have the stories mentioned in the Quran of how the prophets were prepared for the patience and the perseverance that they were going to need in their spiritual mission. And then the Quran, it addresses each and every one of the believers. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. Allah says that most certainly we will try each and every one of you with something of fear and hunger and the loss of those resources and those things that are precious to you and that are near and dear to you. وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. Wealth and life and people and fruit, which could be one's offspring and one's near and dear ones. And it ends with the glad tidings, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. Give glad tidings to those who have sabr, those who have perseverance or patience. الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. That when they are overcome with a musibah, a trial, something that afflicts them, a hardship, they don't forget their Creator, they don't forget their religion, they don't forget the mission of their life, but they bring that trial into the context of their life's mission. And so it doesn't distract them, but it deepens their connection to the mission. They say that verily, our life, it is what belongs to Allah. It does belong to Allah. Sometimes people translate Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un as we are from Allah and we return to Allah. The second part of that is correct. We return to Allah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. But Inna lillah doesn't mean that we come from Allah. It's not a statement of origin. It means that we belong to Allah. We are Allah's at every moment of our life. And our end return will be to face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then face the outcome and the result of our actions, good or evil. So we belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at every moment of our life. It's not an origin that we came from and that we have now become distant from and that we will return to, but we are at all times in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The believers are those who, when they have hardships and difficulties, that reconnects them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and reminds them that whatever they may suffer, whatever they may face, this is part of their mission in life. That is reflected very beautifully in the statement of Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam in that it has become easy for me, or it has been made easy for me to suffer what I am suffering, to know that whatever I am going through, it is in front of the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not outside of the power and the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This isn't something that is outside of the domain and the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's within His power, within His control. So our struggle as believers is to prepare for these trials that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put us through in life. And those trials can be a reminder of our purpose in life. They can be a way for us to understand what abilities and what talents we have within ourselves and how we can better serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I would like to move, before we get to the different types of sabr, some of which are important for us as believers, but not necessarily specifically relevant to what we are trying to accomplish as activists, to the elements of sabr that are specifically relevant to the life of somebody who wants to devote their life to community activism for Islam, towards being a source of inspiration, support, guidance, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills, leadership for the Muslim community. And in this area, we have an excellent model in the lives of our Imams, and of course in the lives of the companions of our Imams. But it's a model that sometimes we don't always appreciate, because we tend to look at the lives of our Imams and their followers as somewhat static. Right? So, if I were to ask those of us present here, many of us at least, what do we know about Malik al-Ashtar? Many of us will have heard of Malik, and we will know that he was one of the noblemen of Kufa. He was involved in the protests against those policies that had taken place in the time of Uthman that were against the teachings of Islam and that many people in different parts of the Islamic world revolted against. We know that he was the right-hand man of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wasalam for as long as Amir al-Mu'mineen. So we have an idea of who Malik was. But sometimes we have a static idea of who Malik was. And so we don't appreciate how Malik became who he was. And so I want to tell just one incident that will give us an inkling, an understanding of the relationship of Amir al-Mu'mineen to Malik. Does anybody know who the first governor of Kufa was, who ruled the city of Kufa under authority from Imam Ali after Imam Ali had become accepted as the ruler of the Muslim world? There's no prize except for a salawat. Somebody knows the answer. It wasn't Talha. You might get a salawat if no one else has the courage to get the right answer. Who was the first governor who ruled Kufa after Imam Ali became appointed the governor of the Muslim world? It wasn't Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, but good guess, because there were some proposals to have Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. Alright, now I'm going to throw out a name, and I want to know whether you think that this is the name or it's not. And don't just assume that because I'm saying it must be right, even if it's not what you would expect. Do you think that Abu Musa al-Ash'ari is a likely candidate?
No.
Why not? Because you can't say his name without saying La'natullahi alayh. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari was one of the companions of the Prophet. He was known as a qari of Quran. So he taught the people of Kufa, some of them, how to recite the Quran. But he was one of those people who were described later on in a hadith of our fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. In a very accurate description of the way of looking at the Quran of many people who were not followers of Ahlul Bayt, the opponents of Ahlul Bayt. أقاموا حروفا وأضاءوا حدودا. How did they look at the Quran? أقاموا حروفا. They're very careful about the huruf of the Quran. Tajweed, how you recite, how do you pronounce this letter? Careful. وَأَضَاءُوا حُدُودًا. And they wasted, let go of the hudud and the meanings of the Quran. So if you hear them recite the Quran, they will say, وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. Perfect every time. Amen. Perfect every time. And then you come and say, okay, now, who are the ضَالِّينَ? Don't worry about it. It's somewhere in the Quran. Allah said it, but don't worry who it refers to. Right? Allah will not refer to somebody, especially in Surah Al-Fatiha, the most important surah, meaninglessly. But they won't say it. So, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari did exactly that. He said that, okay, I will teach you the Quran, and I will teach you the huruf perfectly. Well, not necessarily, but the claim was there. But you're not going to find out from me who are the guided ones, and who are the ones who are astray, and who are the ones who are worthy of Allah's wrath. When Amir al-Mu'mineen called on the people of Kufa to support him against the rebels in Basra, Abu Musa Ash'ari came to the masjid, put on his good cloak, and told people, go home. Don't join the battle. And probably he was inclined to tell people, if anything, to join the opponents of Amir al-Mu'mineen. At the very least, he said, stay home. Don't worry about it. Don't worry if there is a battle between right and wrong. Just read the Quran, pronounce it right. So that hadith of Imam Baqir, it fit very well, and it continued to fit for many of the followers of people like Abu Musa Ash'ari until our present day as well. Recite but don't understand the meanings. So the point is that Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he was one of the leaders of the hypocrites. The people who would put on a very holy exterior, but then destroy the substance of Islam, destroy the substance of the Quran, and actually sit in the Masjid of Kufa and tell people not to go and support or find out the truth. Let me ask you a question that I just asked you. How many of you would believe that that would be the first governor ruling Kufa on behalf of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam? So you believe it probably happened. And you probably believe it happened because I wouldn't be making this fuss over it if it didn't happen. And you don't really believe it. So, what does that mean? Why would the Imam do that? And to add a further complication, several people, enemies of the Imam and friends of the Imam, people like Abdullah ibn al-Abbas and Mughira ibn Shu'bah, so savvy politicians, they came to the Imam, said, you know, all right, now you're the governor, and or the ruler of the Islamic world. There's this person, Muawiyah, in Syria. Why don't you let him stay in his position, just temporarily, get your house in order, consolidate your power. His legitimacy will come through you if you've appointed him as the governor, and then he will have admitted to your authority over him. He can't go back on that once you've accepted his authority. It's a foolproof way to gain power and authority over Muawiyah. And Imam Ali said, "Ma kuntum muttakhidha al-mudillina adalla." I'm not going to take those who misguide people as a source of support to strengthen my power. That's not what's going to happen. Muawiyah, I'm not going to confirm him for a day, for an hour, for a moment. As soon as I have taken charge of the Muslim world, Muawiyah has to go. So why would Imam Ali allow Abu Musa Ash'ari to be the governor? Well, it turns out that this was an opinion that the Imam was opposed to, but the Imam said that somebody advised it, and so I let it be. That advisor was Malik al-Ashtar. He said, keep Abu Musa Ash'ari in Kufa. And so the Imam did so. The difference with Muawiyah, though, was that in this case, the fact that Abu Musa Ash'ari remained in Kufa, it wasn't as if Imam Ali was using him to strengthen his power. Right? Imam Ali already had the authority over Kufa. He was recognized as the governor, so it wasn't strengthening his rule through the use of an evil person. Abu Musa Ash'ari, he was subject to the authority of the Imam, and he was not going to be able to act independently, but he did make the attempt. He did tell people not to join the battle. And so according to some narrations, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he sent his son, Imam Hasan and Ammar ibn Yasir, or according to other narrations, I believe he actually sent Malik and said, you broke it, go fix it. And so, whoever it was, they went to Kufa, and it might have been in two different turns that different people were sent to Kufa, and Abu Musa Ash'ari was very quickly, within the space of a few weeks, maybe a few months at the most, removed from power. And then the Imam proceeded towards Kufa and then to the Battle of Jamal, and he established his capital in the city of Kufa. So what lesson do we learn from this episode in the Imam's life? The lesson that we learn is that as an activist, especially as a leader, but sometimes even as an equal. We have to see the potential in the people that we are interacting with, not where they are today, not in a static sense that this person is insufferable. They don't have the insight, the knowledge, the depth, the profundity, the center, this group, whatever it may be. But we have to see the potential that that person has to try to gain an inkling of it. And sometimes we won't be able to see the potential by, our crystal ball might be broken. So we have to test people's potential. And sometimes we have to test people, and we may discover that they may not have measured up to what we hoped and what we expected, and then we may have to just learn from that experience. But the point is that we have to look at the potential that individuals and communities have, and then salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Look at the potential that our communities, our individuals have, and not look at just the present state. That is something which Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam, he did with Malik al-Ashtar. He took his advice, appointed or confirmed, because Abu Musa Ash'ari was not appointed by Imam Ali right away. He was the governor of Kufa from before. Malik gave advice to the Imam, keep Abu Musa Ash'ari there. The Imam knew Abu Musa Ash'ari was a hypocrite and was not ever going to do any good to Islam or to the Imam or to the Muslims. But he respected Malik's advice until it became clear to Malik and to the people of Kufa, and said that now it's time to go and fix what your hands have done. And the other lesson that we learned from this episode is that not everyone's advice deserves to be respected in that way. Right? The Imam did it with Malik because he knew that Malik was, I wanted to say man enough, but I'm not sure that's going to fly well. That Malik was responsible enough, thank you. That Malik was responsible enough to take ownership of the advice that he gave. That if it did go wrong, that Malik would make it right. And that's something that we have to learn. Sometimes, as activists, we say, okay, we're going to try, we're going to test different things, we're going to respect different opinions. Not every opinion deserves to be respected. And so the Imam did, on occasion, turn down the advice of people who were closer to him, far closer to him, than Malik was. Because he did not have that surety and that confidence that if the advice did not go right, those people would be there with the Imam to make it right. But those who were worthy, the Imam did invest that time and that energy in, and he did even respect where they stood at that time in order to bring them to a higher level of insight. And Malik, he did prove worthy of it. Because when Malik died, this was just a few years later, it wasn't even a very long time, because the Imam only ruled for less than 5 years. So when Malik died, the Imam went to offer condolences to the tribe of Malik. And when the Imam began to speak and praise Malik, his own relatives said that we didn't know if the Imam had come to offer condolences to us, or if we should offer condolences to the Imam that he had lost a loved one or a relative. That is how highly the Imam praised Malik. But we shouldn't just look at that moment and think that that was the entire relationship, that Malik was born perfect and Imam Ali was lucky to have had such a companion for that period of his rule. The Imam created and trained his companion. He brought him to that level. And a similar example exists within the history of the city of Kufa as well. How many of you would like for me to refer to you as Kufi? Right? If you're used to the literature and the poetry, the Noha and the Marsiya of many of our Islamic languages, especially the Shia culture in many places, Kufi is pretty much as bad as saying Yazidi. It's like saying Shia. That's the connotation that we get from the city and the word Kufi. We think of it in negative terms. Right? And I've actually heard people say this. Educated believers that the city of Kufa, or the land of Iraq, it was cursed by Lady Zainab salamullahi alayha, or by Imam Hussein. So they've suffered until today because of that curse. And you might laugh at it, but this is an opinion that if you if you haven't heard it expressed, you will sometimes hear it expressed. We do have very harsh words used by Lady Zainab salamullahi alayha against the city of Kufa. And we do have very harsh words used by Imam Hussein alayhi salam, of course, against the city of Kufa as well. But look at the words of our later Imams, especially from Imam Baqir onwards, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and see if you can find negative expressions towards the city of Kufa. And if we want to create a literature that is loyal to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, we shouldn't freeze ourselves and be static as well, and think that, well, what Kufa was in the year 61 Hijri is what it's going to be until the end of time. The Imam of our time, when he establishes his capital, where will it be? It will be the city of Kufa. And our later Imams, they praise that city very highly, and of course the people of that city as well. And that also is another lesson of how the Imams were able to take a city that had shown weakness time after time with three of our Imams, our first Imam, our second Imam, our third Imam, and transform that city into a place from which the learning, the sciences, and the dedication to the true Islam and to Ahlul Bayt was disseminated from throughout the world. So that in the time of our 7th and our 8th Imam, we find up to 900 or 1,000 scholars in the city of Kufa, in the Masjid of Kufa alone, all of them narrating the ahadith of Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. It's unfortunate if our literature and our conception of the word Kufi takes note of what happened in the year 40 or the year 61 and forgets what happened afterwards. If we remember what happened to our early Imams, but we forget what the interaction of the Imams with the city and its people produced, and the glorious heritage that was bequeathed to all Muslims because of that. So this is something that these examples can remind us of, and it is a very important aspect of the patience of our Imams and the way that they would train their people. Now we have many other examples. One very brief one that I can mention briefly is a family which has a great right on any sheep. The family or the progeny of A'yan, Ahlul A'yan. They produced many fuqaha, scholars, narrators of a hadith. If you were to take away their ahadith from our books of hadith, you would probably be left with very abbreviated books, and in many, many areas of fiqh, in many areas of belief, you may not even be left with many ahadith at all. Right? One of the members of this family, Zurara, was a person who our 6th Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, has said that if it weren't for him and 3 of his companions, then the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt, the ahadith of the Imam's father, the 5th Imam, they would have vanished, they would have perished altogether. So these are people who, as a family, and then certain individuals within that family, had a special role and a special respect in the eyes of the Imams. To the extent that when Zurara passed away in the life of our 7th Imam, our 7th Imam is reported to have said that I have asked for him as a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for him to be in the hereafter with me. Zurara had a brother, Umrah. In Usul al-Kafi, we have some ahadith of when these two were young men. Now, they were primarily the companions of our 6th Imam, especially Zurara. Umrah was also a companion. Actually, both of them were companions of our 5th Imam as well, but they were young men at the time. And we have a hadith of how they would speak and ask questions of the Imam. And in some of the hadith, what is mentioned is that they would argue with the Imam back and forth, and they would raise their voices, and the Imam would raise his voice, and they wouldn't accept until people outside of the house could hear the raised voices of both the Imam and Humran or Zurara, who was arguing with the Imam. And the argument would get heated on both sides. Yet the Imam did not ever say, all right, get out now. Can't show respect to your Imam or to your leader, then it's time for you to leave. That was when they were young men, and they were still learning how to honor and to respect and to interact with the Imams. But the Imams saw the potential and the sincerity, and they continued to show patience with them, to raise them, and both Zurara and Humran and their brothers and their progeny for at least 200 to 300 years continued to serve the school of Ahlul Bayt with singular distinction and honor. So that's another example that we have of the way in which our later Imams, they would interact with people and bring them to their potentials. And that takes supreme patience, especially in the face of ignorance and in the face of that which is unworthy, conduct that cannot be justified, but that is something which a leader or an activist shows patience in the face of because of the potential or the respect that a person is due in their eyes. And that same lesson was also applied by the followers of the Imams with their communities and societies they interacted with. Another very prominent companion of several of our Imams, especially our 7th Imam, Imam Musa Kazim alayhi salatu wasalam, and our 8th Imam, Imam Rida alayhi salatu wasalam, is a man by the name of Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman. Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman, he is a unique figure in the sense that he was one of the pivotal figures to prevent the fitna against the imamat of our 8th Imam that was launched in the time of Harun al-Rashid. He was one of the figures who was pivotal in establishing the principles of jurisprudence and spreading them among the followers of Ahlul Bayt, and also spreading the true aqa'id and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt among their followers. There's many ahadith in praise of Yunus. There's a hadith in which, or there's a report in which Yunus himself, he said that I remained silent for 20 years. And then I asked questions for 20 years from the Imams and from the scholars of the companions of the Imams. And it is only after 40 years, صمت 20 سنة ثم سألت 20 سنة ثم أجبت. So after 40 years of listening and then asking, I began to reply. And he wrote many books. Some of those books, they don't survive in their original form, but they are encapsulated in the books that have come down to us even till today from the Imams in different forms. Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman, he was a person who faced especially difficult times from those who claimed to be followers of the Imams and who were associated with the Imams, because it was his job to stand in the face of bid'ah, in the face of false teachings, false spiritual teachings and fiqhi rulings, false beliefs, and especially people who would want to use the name or the likeness or the heritage of the Imams to introduce their own un-Islamic concepts into Islam. It was a very difficult task. As any of us who was ever trying to stand up in a masjid and say, well, maybe this practice isn't good, can appreciate just a small inkling of it. And it is said that once Yunus was in the company of our 8th Imam, Imam Ali Rida alayhi salatu wassalam. When a group of the Shia from Basra came in, they asked permission to enter into the Imam. Basra was a city, it's a port city, it was a major city, and it was a city that had a strong presence of people inimical to Ahlul Bayt, who did not like Ahlul Bayt. And so it was a city that was kind of a weird collection of different beliefs, and even the Shia, or the followers of Ahlul Bayt, they were influenced by the currents and the intellectual trends that were prevalent in the city. So they came in the presence of the Imam, and before the Imam admitted them into his company, he told Yunus to go into the next room and to pull the curtain, and not to come out until the Imam gave him permission. People came in, they greeted the Imam, and they started bad-mouthing Yunus, one after another. And the Imam bowed his head and listened. Perhaps he responded in some way, but if it wasn't appropriate or wasn't going to be effective, then the Imam would not even necessarily respond to their statements and their provocations. But when they had finished, the Imam dismissed them from his presence. He gave the signal to Yunus come out. Yunus came out with his beard wet with tears. He said, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, I dedicate my life to this community. These same people, I risked my life, gave my youth, my prayers, my efforts, my health, to learn the truth and then to convey it to them. And this is what they think of me? Not a prayer, if they see something which they think is wrong, not a may Allah guide Yunus, but may Allah curse Yunus. And so, as he was crying, the Imam said to him, that, "O Yunus, tell me, if you have a jewel in your hand, and all of them came to you and told you that it was a pebble, or the whole world came to you and told you it was a pebble, would it not be worth what a jewel is worth? Would it become a pebble? And if you had a pebble in your hand, and these same people, or the whole world came to you and told you, that's a wonderful jewel you have, would it be a jewel, or would it still be a worthless pebble?" And he said that, what does it bother you? If your Imam and your Creator are pleased with you, what the people may say. And this is the perspective that gives us the ability to develop the patience. These lessons, they are there, and the stories of the Imams and the stories of the companions of the Imams, they give us the framework by which we can face the challenges that we face within our own communities and the difficulties that do exist in our own time as well. Yunus, he also had a wasiyah that I think is very instructive for all of us to listen to. And no matter how young we are, and no matter how many decades or centuries off we think that our own death is going to be, it's useful for us to incorporate it into our own wasiyah as well. Because all of us should have a wasiyah. Right? And the wasiyah, more so than dividing physical assets, it really is about bequeathing a spiritual heritage. If you look at the wasiyah of the Prophet, the wasiyah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, especially preserved in Nahj al-Balagha and elsewhere, they focus much more on the spiritual heritage and inheritance that the Imams wanted to bequeath to their survivors. So one part of the final words of Yunus are that if anybody has offended me or wronged me or done an injustice to me, إن كان له في ولاية أمير المؤمنين نصيب فإنه في حل مني. If that person has any share in the wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, I've forgiven them. If Amir al-Mu'mineen decides that a particular person is not worthy of Amir al-Mu'mineen's wilayah, that is between the Imam and him. And the Imam may make that determination. He may make that determination because the person was so evil towards Yunus that the Imam says, I don't want to have anything to do with you. But the beauty of it is that Yunus didn't say that because I was so offended or I was hurt, or because I am representing now Islam and fighting me is fighting Islam. Right? So sometimes that impression does come into our minds. He said it's up to Amir al-Mu'mineen to make that determination. I leave it for the hereafter. If Amir al-Mu'mineen sees some good in that person and maintains a connection no matter how tenuous with the person, I've forgiven them whatever rights I may have over them. And leave it in the hands of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And if Amir al-Mu'mineen, of course, disconnects that relationship, then that is up to him. So that is the wasiyah of Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman, and it's a very beautiful representation of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt ﷺ, represented in the life and in the words of one of the most loyal companions and followers of Ahlul Bayt ﷺ. The patience, or one dimension of the patience that we should show towards our fellow Muslims and our fellow believers is to develop our relationship with one another on the basis of wilayat of Amir al-Mu'mineen. That is the basis of our relationship, because that is the essence of the true path of Islam. And if that relationship exists, then we should be willing strategically to overlook anything that might personally offend or hurt or even harm us. And if we are to dissociate from somebody, then it should not in any case be because of that personal hurt or that harm, but solely because of what it means for Islam. It's a difficult determination to make. In some cases, we may fool ourselves into thinking that, no, I don't like that person because of God's sake. But in reality, somewhere in our heart, it's because of our own vendetta or our own sense of animosity towards that person. And in that time, we should leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to decide whether that person is worthy of His mercy or not. We should leave it to the Prophet and leave it to the Imams to determine whether that person is worthy of a connection to them or not. And then simply say within our hearts that conditional, as Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman did. If they keep that connection, then I have kept it. And if they don't, then I will also sever and break apart that connection. And this concept now of patience and perseverance that we have, and the relationship that we should have with our fellow believers, it is closely tied not only to the concept of sabr in the Quran, but also to the concept of hilm within Islamic traditions. And hilm, it means forbearance, or it's also sometimes referred to as anat in Arabic, that ability to show dignity in the face of the ignorance of those who are ignorant. And that is one of the defining characteristics of our Imams. When Imam Hasan al-Mujtaba alayhi salatu wassalam was martyred, one of the first and the most active people to march at the funeral of Imam Hasan was a man by the name of Marwan ibn al-Hakam. And the sight of Marwan walking behind the funeral of Imam Hasan was a little too much for Imam Hussein to bear. So he turned to Marwan and he said, "Are you here? And just yesterday you would do everything in your power to cause pain and hurt to Imam Hasan? You're walking in his funeral, have you no shame, no dignity?" And Marwan said, "كنت أفعل ذلك بمن يوازن حلمه الجبال." I would do that to a person whose hilm and forbearance was weightier than the mountains. And so that was my evil nature, the expression of the thought of Marwan. That was my evil nature that compelled me to do that. But within me there is also a recognition that I will never find somebody like Imam Hasan. And there is a sense of loss or mourning that the entire Islamic Ummah did feel at the loss of somebody like Imam Hasan, who was well known for his hilm. And all of our Imams, they were also known for that attribute of having supreme patience and the ability to forbear the ignorance of others. One of the defining parts of hilm is kadhmul ghayb, covering up one's anger, and that is in fact where the title of our seventh Imam derives from. He's known as Imam al-Kadhim because of that aspect of hilm that was so well represented within his character. So hilm is one of the attributes that we need to be working on developing, and there is a saying of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, quoted in Nahj al-Balagha, where he says that sometimes we may not feel that forbearance within ourselves. It may not come naturally. And some of us, we have a greater degree of natural or innate patience and forbearance than others. But even if it doesn't come natural, in lam takun haliman fatahalla. If it doesn't come natural to you, that's my signal to now to begin ending my speech, right? No. If it doesn't come natural to you, fatahalla, then compel yourself to show forbearance. فَإِنَّهُ قَلَّ مَنْ تَشَبَّهَ بِقَوْمٍ إِلَّا أَوْشَكَ أَنْ يَكُونَ مِنْهُ. because very rarely has a person become similar to a group or tried to be like a people, except that he will very nearly or very soon join them. And so hilm is something that we have to develop within ourselves, and if we can't develop it and we don't have it, we have to pretend. We have to show it. And if we do show it, then eventually it will become part of our second nature. And that is one of the most beautiful lessons that we have from the lives of all of our Imams. This is salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And the Prophet of Islam and the Imams, it is that much more important for us to develop. It's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He took special care to ensure that His prophets were trained in, to be patient. So we have in some reports that many of the prophets, before they were appointed as a prophet by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they engaged in shepherding animals, because that is a very difficult job, and it kind of trains a person to try to communicate with animals that cannot communicate back. And that really takes a great deal of personal development and strength to be able to do. Now today, sometimes that parable may seem to be condescending, to say that, well, shepherding sheep is a good training for being a prophet of God. But the element that is being trained and that is being practiced is the patience. And the ability to engage with animals, any one of them might be enough to make us forget any obligation we have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or anything else that is going on in our life. The tragedies of health, of loss of property and wealth, loss of near and dear ones and family members, and then the ridicule or the ostracization from society. All of those things individually are very severe tests, let alone when they come all together. Similarly, we have the test of Ibrahim alayhi salam when he was asked to sacrifice his son. It's also detailed in the Quran. So in some cases, we have the stories mentioned in the Quran of how the prophets were prepared for the patience and the perseverance that they were going to need in their spiritual mission. And then the Quran, it addresses each and every one of the believers. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. Allah says that most certainly we will try each and every one of you with something of fear and hunger and the loss of those resources and those things that are precious to you and that are near and dear to you. وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. Wealth and life and people and fruit, which could be one's offspring and one's near and dear ones. And it ends with the glad tidings, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. Give glad tidings to those who have sabr, those who have perseverance or patience. الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. That when they are overcome with a musibah, a trial, something that afflicts them, a hardship, they don't forget their Creator, they don't forget their religion, they don't forget the mission of their life, but they bring that trial into the context of their life's mission. And so it doesn't distract them, but it deepens their connection to the mission. They say that verily, our life, it is what belongs to Allah. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we're coming to the end of another day at this retreat, and I know that we've had discussions, workshops, lectures, and I'm going to try to take it easy by, even though I don't have a clock in front of me to let me know when I'm running close to or liable to go over my time, I'm going to try to keep it within a reasonable amount of time and give a few thoughts on the topic that was given to me, which is the patience of an activist. And this is a topic which it's extremely important for us to think about. Because we have, of course, a hadith that do indicate that patience is in fact one of the key or the most important attributes of a believer. It is important that the Prophet was asked, what is Iman? Iman is patience. And that is a key part of Iman, no matter how it may be defined and how it may be looked at. And for those of us who want to keep alive and to traverse the path of the prophets, those that seem not to be able to understand or have any intellect of their own. It isn't to treat people that way. That false impression, of course, should not be taken. So our Imams, our prophets, something that their preparation for their role entailed was to reach the highest level of sabr. In some cases now we have that training explained to us in the Quran or in traditions. And especially with previous prophets, for example, we have ways that readiness for the task of guiding or leading or working with a community was brought to the Prophet. The story of Nuh alayhi salam indicates that he preached among his people for close to 1,000 years. It's the exact words of the Quran, 950 years. And the story of Ayub, which is recited before I gave my speech, it indicates that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tried him through different kinds of tests that if any of us were subjected to,